Number 10. Time travel. In April 2017, an Oregon man's guilt led him to researching time travel. He wasn't doing it to be a hero, though. Instead, he wanted to reverse a horrible mistake. 30-year-old William Hargrove was done being single, so he signed up for a dating app and met 27-year-old Anna Repkina, a Russian woman who'd just broken up with her boyfriend of 7 years. There was an instant spark between them, and within weeks, Repkina was ready to fly 5,500 miles from Moscow to Oregon for her new lover. Her 10-day trip was almost too good to be true. Hargrove proposed to her with a beautiful engagement ring. What she didn't know, though, was the fact that all this time he'd been having an affair with his landlady, Michelle Chavez, who was married herself. So it turned into quite the love triangle. The landlady actually wanted him to leave Repkina and gave him an ultimatum to choose who he wanted. Just 2 days later, a groundskeeper near Alcia found the Russian bride's dead body near a remote logging road. It would have been impossible to trace her murder back to Hargrove, but he made the mistake of leaving a KFC receipt near her body, which led to his arrest. Interestingly, the man was researching time travel in the wake of her murder and kept frantically asking people if they knew any way of turning back time. On top of wanting to sell his soul for a time travel machine, he'd also written down magic spells to reverse the clock. Still, all that guilt didn't stop him from stopping by an ATM and withdrawing $800 from his fiance's account. Even though he blamed Chavez for the murder, he was eventually put in prison for life. Number 9. Football player. Number 9. Football player. In April 2022, Portland police were called to a local bar at 1 a.m. regarding a shooting. Once there, they found a dead body. It was later identified as a 19-year-old college student named Amara Marluke, who was not only an on-campus leader, but an activist and a big part of Portland State University community. She was shot and killed right in front of Max Market near the cheerful Tortoise Bar. Here's where it gets interesting. The suspect who fled the scene that night actually confessed. 20-year-old Keenan Harpole was the murderer and turned himself in at the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office just hours after the shooting. He used to play on the school's football team but was no longer on the roster. No one even knew Harpole and Marluke had a relationship, and it was only after a thorough investigation that detectives reached the conclusion. According to them, it was a surefire case of domestic violence. Harpole was booked into Multnomah County Jail on charges of second-degree murder and unlawful use of a weapon. Number 8. The Hitman. We've seen countless cases of someone committing murder in self-defense, but what happened in Portland in 2006 will go down as the most insane act of defiance ever. 51-year-old Susan Walters had been married to her husband Michael Kuhnhausen for more than 15 years, but their relationship was far from perfect. In fact, Michael actually wanted to get rid of his wife without getting a divorce. He devised a sneaky plan to hire a hitman to do his dirty work. He paid $50,000 to a crack addict named Edward Haffey and told him to bludgeon Susan to death. He was supposed to make it look like a burglary gone wrong. Haffey then broke into Walter's home and waited for her. As soon as she stepped in, he pounced and started hitting her with the hammer. He hadn't anticipated that she'd fight back too, though, because after 15 minutes of struggling, she managed to wrestle him to the ground and grab his throat. She then relaxed her grip, demanding to know who'd sent him, but as soon as he tried to break free, she choked him to death. Thankfully, it didn't take long for her to confirm her suspicions. She found a note in the hitman's backpack linking him to her husband, so Michael had no other option but to plead guilty to a charge of soliciting to commit aggravated murder. He spent 8 years behind bars, and Susan, on the other hand, installed a security system and sued him for $1 million just so he wouldn't pull something similar off again. Number 7. Person of interest. In November 2018, a defense attorney was named the prime suspect in his own wife's murder. 47-year-old Tricia Carver lived with her 42-year-old husband Lamar Carver and was reported missing by her family members in Hillsborough. Unfortunately, the search didn't pan out the way everyone had hoped, since the authorities found her dead body in a field near St. Paul that same day. Now, since the couple lived together, all of the fingers were pointing towards the defense attorney husband named Lamar. The Marion County Sheriff's Office even issued a search warrant to go into the home and look for clues. And when they arrived at the home, though, all they found was yet another dead body. It was indeed Lamar, who apparently had self-inflicted gunshot wounds. And that being said, it's unclear how long he'd been dead before they discovered him. Of course, no suspects were set in stone, which makes the whole situation even more questionable. The assumption here was that he couldn't bear to get caught for killing his wife, and at the same time he could have also shot himself to avoid suspicion. Regardless, everyone involved in the case was devastated. A spokesperson for the sheriff's office said that they've now got 2 families reeling, which makes this case so much worse. In fact, to this day, the case remains unsolved. Number 6. The author. Ever heard of someone being suspiciously specific about something, almost as if they've experienced it for themselves? Yeah, well, it turns out the author of How to Murder Your Husband really knew what she was talking about. 71-year-old Nancy Crampton Brophy, a romance novelist, was probably speaking from experience when she wrote her essay since, apparently, she did actually kill her 63-year-old husband Daniel Brophy in 2018. According to the prosecutors, the murder was motivated by money issues and a life insurance policy. Here's the interesting part. She claimed she had no reason to kill her husband since their financial problems were largely solved by cashing in some of their retirement savings. To add to that, the essay was actually written in 2011, almost 7 years before the actual murder. That being said, the writing was still very detailed, with listing options for committing an untraceable crime. So perhaps she'd been contemplating the murder for a decade. Then again, you can't do much against solid evidence since she owned the same model of gun used to kill her husband. Plus, she was also seen driving to and from the crime scene by witnesses. Besides, even though the police never found the actual gun that killed Brophy, it's believed that Nancy swapped out its barrel, used it in the shooting, and then threw it away. Nancy was eventually charged with second-degree murder. Number 5. Burn pile. In November 2018, Beaverton police got a report about some weird things happening in the neighborhood. When they got to the scene, they found what can only be described as a charred body. In fact, it was so badly crisped that it almost took 2 months to identify. It was Amy Lowe, who lived on Allen Boulevard with 42-year-old Alan Muniz and another man. Right after the identification, police went to the home to investigate with a search warrant, and it didn't take long for them to link Muniz to the murder. Apparently, he'd beaten Lowe to death and then chucked her into a burn pile in the backyard. He was probably hoping for her body to turn to ash, but thankfully, the neighbors realized the stench wasn't just part of some barbecue. Even though he was arrested on the spot, his real intentions were never really uncovered. Interestingly, this wasn't his first offense either. He'd recently been released from prison for first-degree robbery, so maybe he was just trying to one-up his own disturbing record. Muniz was later convicted of murder and first-degree abuse of a corpse. Number 4. The voices made me do it. In October 2021, a meth-induced trip resulted in not one, but 2 murders in the Portland area. 45-year-old Michael Van Domelen, who lived in an apartment complex on Northwest 6th Avenue, wasn't in his right mind when he charged into a neighbor's apartment holding a 9mm gun in his pocket. Apparently, he was high on meth and heard voices in his head telling him to do stuff. So instead of questioning anything, he went ahead and gunned down 2 people. Now, obviously, the other neighbors heard the shots and rushed to the hallway to see what the commotion was. One of them, after seeing the dead bodies, even ran into Michael on his way back. Not only that, but he asked the guy if he knew who fired the gun. His response? I did. Police quickly responded to the distress call. They arrested Michael straight away. He actually admitted to the murder while talking to the police as well, claiming the voices told him to kill people. His tone changed really quickly when he reached court. He pleaded not guilty. But by then, though, it was already too late because he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Number 3. Refrigerated. In September 2021, 3 people were arrested after the body of a 24-year-old was found in a refrigerator. The Medford police got a call about an assault on Royal Avenue in the middle of the day, and while there wasn't anything too suspicious going on, they did see someone run into a nearby apartment. They detained the suspicious person and later found a dead body inside their fridge. Identified as Aaron Stitt, the body had severe skull fractures, as if he'd been beaten by a hammer. When it initially seemed like a classic homicide, the case turned into a Pandora's box of possibilities after they realized that the first suspect wasn't even the apartment's owner. Instead, it belonged to 20-year-old Bryson Schofield, who was arrested with 25-year-old Austin McLeod and his younger brother Dylan. Not only that, but police also found firearms on the property, only by chance though, because the suspects tried very hard to clean the scene of any evidence. Here's the fascinating part. Apparently Stitt stole from one of his killers before the incident, and they wanted to give him a taste of his own medicine by robbing him. But clearly, something went horribly wrong. All 3 suspects were charged with murder as well as concealment of evidence. Number 2. The All-Father. When an Oregon medical student was asked to donate sperm in the late 80s, he was promised that only 5 kids would be born, all far away from him. But little did he know he'd end up becoming a father to nearly a whole football squad. In 2019, Dr. Bryce Cleary filed a $5.25 million lawsuit against Oregon Health and Science University, claiming that they didn't honor their promise of only using his sperm for East Coast residents. Instead, most of it was used for kids in Oregon. The 5 children he was promised back in '89? Well, it turns out his juices were potent enough for over 17 babies. The majority of the children went to school, church, or social functions with each other without even realizing they were half-siblings. Cleary claimed that he was a victim of fraud and suffered emotional distress after hearing about the births. He found out about the other kids when a couple of them tracked him down through Ancestry.com. It was only when he sent off his own DNA to the website that he realized he was a father to at least 17 kids. Yeah, that's not really a great look, but hey, at least he can claim to be one of the most fertile men in Oregon. Number 1, dumped in a landfill. In August 2022, a Washington County woman was reported missing, and only 4 days later, her body was found dead in a landfill dumpster. 27-year-old Kaylee Birdsell was in an abusive relationship with 31-year-old Fabian Hernandez. While she didn't want to be with him anymore, she couldn't leave him because he'd regularly threatened to do something if she did. Kaylee also couldn't run away because her boyfriend lived with her and watched her, so even if she wanted to escape, she wouldn't have been able to. To make things worse, Fabian carried a firearm all the time, and sadly it proved to be the cause of Kaylee's death. She'd been traveling through a rural area in her Jeep and stopped one night to get some shut-eye. Little did she know, though, that this was a permanent slumber. Fabian, for some reason, pulled the gun out and shot her several times. The gun he used was a large-caliber revolver. He then dragged her body to the Coffin Butte landfill in Corvallis and threw it in a dumpster. Obviously, it wasn't hard for someone to realize there was a rotting, smelly corpse in the dumpster, especially with the smell of decomposing flesh in the air. It didn't take long for police to get to the scene and confirm it was Kaylee. As a result, Fabian was arrested and charged with second-degree murder for his crimes. Number 10, that's not garbage. Ingrid Line, a 40-year-old mother of 3 from Seattle, Washington, was brutally murdered back in 2017 after coming home from a Mariners baseball game. She went to the event on a date with 38-year-old John Charlton, whom she had met online about a year before. On April 19th, her former partner reported her missing when she failed to pick up her children from his home. A wellness check was then performed at the woman's house, but officers were far from prepared for what they found inside. Police discovered a 15-inch or 38-centimeter pruning saw left near the bathtub that had human flesh inside it. While searching for more evidence, authorities found some of Ingrid's limbs wrapped in plastic inside the neighbor's trash cans. At the local recycling and garbage plant, even more were discovered. Charlton was the main suspect in the case since he had violent criminal history and his own parents had a restraining order against him. He initially denied the murder allegations for over a year, but he has since fully confessed to the crime. For the murder of Ingrid Line, Charlton was sentenced to 333 months behind bars, which is a little less than 28 years. The judge said she would have given him life in prison without parole if only the law allowed it. Number 9, it happens all the time. Colin Baltazar was accused of killing and decapitating his own 70-year-old mother in a quiet neighborhood in Shoreline, Washington. Laurie Collins, Baltazar's mother, was a budget manager for Seattle Pacific University. The day she was killed, her neighbor noticed that her car was still parked in her driveway when she should have been at work. Loud thumping and screaming were also heard by the neighbor coming from Laurie's house at around 2 a.m. So officers came the next morning at 9 a.m. to conduct a welfare check. When authorities asked Baltazar about the screaming, he claimed that he and his mother had gotten into an argument and that, quote, it happened all the time. But when deputies were unable to reach Collins by phone, they forced their way into the house to see what really happened. According to news outlets, Collins' decapitated body was found in the upstairs bedroom near a baseball bat. Baltazar was arrested at the scene for the gruesome and violent murder. Baltazar is now facing second-degree murder charges and is currently being held on $2 million bail. He was supposed to be formally charged for the crime on July 5th, but there has not been any recent public updates on the case. Number 8, Firefight. A fatal shooting happened in a Seattle, Washington parking lot when an insane man holding a gun opened fire on 2 women in their cars. The attack was completely random and left one of the victims dead after getting shot in the face 3 times in February 2021. The shooter was identified on social media as Greg Taylor by one of the man's friends. There were several witnesses to the crime and many of them called 911 after hearing multiple shots being fired. One of the calls came from the second woman in the car while her friend lay dying. The girl was unable to give their exact location, but police arrived just moments later. The suspect was warned to drop his weapon, but he ignored their warnings. He raised his weapon again, this time directing it towards the officers. A firefight soon broke out between law enforcement and the deranged gunman, but they were able to take him down quickly. Officers then turned their focus towards finding the 2 victims that had been shot at. They found the girls, but one of them had already died before they arrived. The name of the women were not released, but they found no connection between them and the suspect. The terrible tragedy serves as a reminder that accidents like this can happen at any time or place, and that people are capable of carrying out awful crimes even on complete strangers. Number 7. Alexander J. 62-year-old Kim Hayes was on her way to work at Harborview Medical Center, where she served as a nurse when she was attacked by a homeless man. Seattle has been plagued by crimes from homeless encampments over the last few years. In March 2022, Hayes was targeted by 40-year-old Alexander J. while she made her way through the Chinatown International District. She was walking up the stairs when, out of nowhere, Jay grabbed her and threw her roughly down the cement steps. The healthcare worker suffered 3 broken ribs and a broken clavicle. She was rushed to the same hospital that she had worked at for 25 years and received surgery from her colleagues to treat her injuries. Apparently, this was not the first time Jay had a run-in with the law. He had a long criminal history, including theft, charges of burglary, drug possession, selling stolen property, multiple counts of domestic violence, and auto theft. On top of all of that, he had been given 15 bench warrants for failing to show up to his hearings. Also, it's since been reported that within hours of him pushing Hayes down the stairs, he stabbed another woman and beat another man to death at a nearby Metro Transit bus stop. Alexander J. was charged with murder and 2 counts of second-degree assault and is currently behind bars on $5.6 million bond. He's set to appear in court on August 29th, but no news has been released regarding his sentencing. Number 6. Star Beast. A woman from Vancouver, Washington was denied a restraining order against her estranged husband just before he viciously stabbed her to death on November 7th, 2021. Monica Murrah, or Star as she was nicknamed, had a rocky relationship with her husband Michael Murrah. She stated on several occasions that Michael had threatened to kill himself while they were arguing, and even went as far as putting a knife by their bed when they'd fight. Michael also allegedly choked and hit Star many times while high on drugs. Star claimed her husband had also physically abused their 7-year-old son and that she was scared for their lives. Unfortunately, Star's attempts to receive permanent restraining orders against Michael was denied by a court in August 2021 thanks to insufficient grounds just months before her murder. According to the Oregonian news site, police were called to the Murrah residence at 10:40 a.m. that Sunday morning, where they found Michael holding a blood-stained knife. They soon discovered Star's body with multiple stab wounds in her neck. They rushed her to the hospital, but she was later pronounced dead from her injuries. Their young son was also at home at the time of the attack, but was thankfully left unharmed. When questioned by the authorities, Michael claimed that he'd killed Star, which he called Star Beast, to fulfill a prophecy. The man was obviously beyond delusional, maybe partly due to his extensive substance abuse problem, but he was still taken into custody for the crime. For the gruesome killing of Mania Star Murray, Michael was charged with first-degree murder and held on $2 million bail, set to be arraigned on November 19th. In Clark County Superior Court, he pleaded not guilty and was ordered to undergo a competency evaluation by the judge. Since then, there have been no updates regarding the case, and his trial date is still on hold. Do you think there was an actual prophecy, or do you think Michael was just crazy? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Number 5. Uncle Husband. 44-year-old Timothy McNamara was found dead in Belize from a gunshot wound to his head, and police were later accused of setting the whole thing up to look like murder. Tracy Shannon Nessel had fallen in love with McNamara, who was 22 years older than she was. Oh, and to top things off, he was actually her biological uncle. They had met each other in 2012 when the two were visiting her grandparents in Soap Lake, Washington. At the time, McNamara was going through his 3rd divorce and had an immediate connection with Nessel, his young niece. But Nessel claimed they, quote, didn't know each other in that way, and that she never knew him as her uncle. The two sides of the family didn't spend much time together, so they felt like they weren't doing anything particularly wrong. She said that they fell in love and that their souls were instantly connected. McNamara had adult children from previous marriages, and they were understandably disturbed by the pair's incestuous developing relationship. In order to escape scrutiny, Nessel and McNamara ran away to Belize using a $240,000 insurance payout that they used to buy a farm in the Central American country. The man's children stopped talking to their father, and as their family's relationship fell apart, so did McNamara's finances. In December 2014, Nessel heard a gunshot outside outside of their home and said she found McNamara lying on their porch. Initially, she said she had no involvement in the crime and was framed by police for the murder, but later in March 2022, 8 years after the incident, she was found guilty of participating in the willful and unlawful killing of her uncle husband. Sounds like the relationship was doomed from the start. Number 4, Breakin gone wrong. A 36-year-old man from Gig Harbor, Washington was killed by his neighbor after trying to break into the man's home in July of 2022. Neither of the men in the case were identified by name, and the incident took place after the now-deceased man had an argument with his girlfriend, who later went next door to stay for the night. After finding out she was with the neighbor, he attempted to let himself into the home to see her. Apparently, the woman had a no-contact order against her boyfriend, so he was not supposed to be anywhere near her. While trying to get into the home, he was accused of threatening his girlfriend and others who were inside. The homeowner, protecting himself and his property, then shot and killed the man on his back porch, where he was later found by police. Recognized as a case of self-defense, officers did not charge the man who fired with murder or any crimes for that matter, but the investigation is still ongoing. Once it's complete, it will be moved to the prosecutor's office. Number 3, cold case. A cold case dating back to 1998 has just been solved recently in 2022, and a woman's fiancé is now suspected of hiring a hitman. On August 22, 1998, James Christopher Johnson found his fiancé's body in their apartment's bedroom closet in Arlington, Washington. Johnson reported to authorities that some bags and coins were missing from the space, along with the Honda Civic that belonged to the woman. When police got to the scene to investigate, they found no signs of forced entry or even a struggle. Johnson told officers about a suspicious man, someone who was given Sincata's old computer and was upset that it wasn't working well. The suspect was identified as a 54-year-old man named Bobby Joe Leonard, but no concrete evidence was ever found to convict Leonard, so the case went cold after no other leads were discovered. Fast forward to July 2022. While pleading guilty to the murder of Andrea Sincata, Leonard also confessed that a man he suspected to be the woman's then fiancé offered to pay him $5,000 to kill her. But this allegation has not yet been proven, and Johnson was placed under home confinement until his next trial that will take place on September 12th. Number 2, revenge. A father from Spokane, Washington was accused of killing his daughter's boyfriend after finding out he had sold her into a sex trafficking ring back in 2021. The young woman's father, 60-year-old John Eisenman, is currently being held on $1 million bond after getting charged with first-degree murder. In October 2020, Eisenman discovered that his young daughter had been sex trafficked and later found out that her own boyfriend was responsible. One night, Eisenman found out where the boyfriend would be and drove him to his location in Airway Heights. He waited for the 19-year-old to arrive and then abducted him. He tied him up and put him into his car's trunk before hitting him in the head with a cinder block and stabbing him to death. Eisenman then abandoned the vehicle in a remote area with the body still left inside. The remains of the girl's ex-boyfriend were not found until a year later, and Eisenman was charged with first-degree murder. But new evidence suggests the boy had nothing to do with the sex trafficking allegations at all, and that Eisenman was high on methamphetamine when the murder took place. Number 1, Capitol Hill Massacre. A party turned into an absolute nightmare back in March of 2006 when a man with a gun decided to end the lives of 6 innocent people. Kyle Huff was at a party after the Better Off on Dead rave on March 24th in Seattle, Washington. He kept to himself for most of the night though, until about 6 a.m. when he left the event to retrieve some guns from his truck. He immediately started shooting people sitting outside the home before going back into the building to continue his rampage. He fired more than 300 rounds in total until he spotted a police officer that had come to respond to the scene. He then turned the gun on himself, ending his own life. There was no clear motive for the senseless killing spree, and with the suspect now deceased, it's unlikely detectives will ever know the reason behind this terrible crime. Number 10, Deadly Love Affair. A family was torn apart in Idaho after an affair turned deadly. The cheating woman's husband shot and killed her lover. College sweethearts Ashley and Emmett Corrigan got married in 2004 after meeting at a Utah State University in 2003. The couple moved to Boise, Idaho, and after a few years started to grow their family. They had 4 kids by 2010. At that time, Emmett worked as an attorney. He was just starting out and had opened his own practice for bankruptcy law to provide for his growing family. Ashley was pregnant with their 5th child when she found out her husband had started an affair with his assistant, Candy Hall. She started to get suspicious after Emmett kept missing her prenatal appointments for, quote, late hours at the office. Candy was also married and had 2 teenage daughters of her own. Emmett claimed he was only working so much to provide for their family, but his affair continued into 2011. In March of that year, Ashley decided it was time to confront him, and Candy's husband, Robert, did the same thing, in an attempt to save their respective marriages. Emmett and Ashley's 5th child was only 6 weeks old at the time, and she didn't want to raise her children in a broken home. Things took a deadly turn later that night when Candy and Emmett met up at a Walgreens to have sex nearby in a subdivision. Robert followed them to the store and was waiting with a gun. The 2 men got into a heated argument in the parking lot, and Emmett was killed after Robert shot him twice, once in the head and once in the chest. After killing Emmett, Robert turned the gun on himself but survived when the bullet, quote, only grazed his head. He suffered a concussion from the gunshot, which caused him to have amnesia. He insisted he didn't remember what happened that night, but was still convicted of second-degree murder in 2012. For his crime, Robert was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison. Number 9. The Black Widow. Lydia Southard is often considered Idaho's first female serial killer. In the early 1900s, Lydia lived in Idaho, where she got her nickname the Black Widow. She married 6 men and killed all of them to collect the life insurance money. She first married Robert C. Dooley and had her only child, a daughter named Lorraine. The couple lived with Robert's brother Edward until 1915. Little Lorraine unexpectedly passed away, and then shortly after, Edward was also found dead. Later that same year, her husband died, leaving Lydia all the money. Only 2 years later, Lydia married another victim, William G. McCaffell. The two moved to Montana, where they lived for over a year before William passed away in 1918. The cause of death was labeled as, quote, complications of influenza. She continued her killing spree when she married a 3rd man, Harlan Lewis, in 1919 while living in Montana. She seemed tired of waiting, and Harlan was dead after only 3 months of marriage. To avoid suspicion, she moved back to Idaho, where she married a chemist named Earl Dooley. Earl was found dead a month after the wedding. Eventually, her husband's untimely deaths caught the eye of the police, and tests were performed on the deceased victims' bodies. All of the men had traces of arsenic in their body, which is extremely poisonous. Lydia fled the state and went to California while the investigation was ongoing. While hiding from police, she somehow managed to marry another man, Paul Southard. She tried to convince Paul to take out a large insurance policy, but since he was covered by the military, he declined. Thanks to Paul's work, the couple moved to Hawaii, where police finally caught up to the killer. Lydia spent the rest of her life in jail, and rightly so. Number 8. The Snake River Killer. In the late 70s, a string of disappearances happened in Lewis-Clark Valley. From 1979 to 1982, people were vanishing left and right, and law enforcement had no clue what was happening. The first victim was young Christina White, who was only 12 years old. She was last seen at the country fair when she never returned home. After the first disappearance, 4 others had the same fate. In 1981, 22-year-old Kristen David was riding her bike from Moscow, Idaho to Lewiston, Idaho, and never finished her trip. Her remains were found in a garbage bag by a fisherman in the Snake River 8 days later. In September 1982, stepsisters Jacqueline Miller, who was 18 years old, and 21-year-old Christina Nelson went missing after walking to the grocery store near their home. Christina left a note for her boyfriend at the time, letting him know that they would be back soon. This wasn't the case. On the same night, 35-year-old Stephen Pearshaw also vanished after getting dropped off at the Lewiston Civic Theater to do laundry and practice his clarinet. Police originally thought the 2 girls and Stephen left the area to join a cult. Unfortunately, the stepsisters' bodies were found on a hillside off the highway about 40 miles or under 65 kilometers outside Lewiston. The official reports labeled their deaths as homicides, and the perpetrator is now known as the Snake River Killer. Only 3 of the bodies were ever discovered, and as far as who the murderer was, it's still a mystery. Number 7. Evil Ex-Wife. 20-year-old Vernon Jensen lived in Boise, Idaho, where he was studying to become a respiratory therapist. He was going through a rough divorce and having a hard time. He thought things were finally turning around for him when he met Vicki Jensen, a nurse from the hospital he worked at. During their long shifts, the two became quite close, and he opened up to her about his divorce. Vicki was a divorced mom with a 4-year-old son, and after a while, Vernon decided to take her on a few dates. They only had gone out a few times, so Vernon didn't consider what they had to be a serious relationship. Vicky saw things differently. While Vernon was away with friends one weekend, she called his home and spoke with his mother. She admitted to calling every Jensen in the phone book until she got the right house. After this invasion of privacy, she said she was his girlfriend. At the time, Vernon just landed a job in Twin Falls, Idaho, about 2 hours away from Boise. He didn't ask her. Instead, Vicky decided she was going with him. Once Vernon's divorce was final, she told them they were going to get married, and they did. Not long after the wedding, Vicky became verbally and physically abusive. Vernon knew something was really wrong after she made plans to kill his ex-wife. She brought insulin home one day and said, quote, "I'm going to take care of it." He stopped her by grabbing the insulin and syringes and throwing them in a dumpster where she wouldn't find them. This was the last straw for Vernon, so the two separated. While working extra shifts to pay for a divorce lawyer, he met Alita Diane Ray, who was a nurse's aide at his new job. The two hit it off, and Alita was completely opposite of Vicky. She was extremely caring, and Vernon fell in love with her smile. After the couple moved in together, they started to see Vicky following them around. He planned to move far away in order to start his new life with Alita, but he didn't act fast enough. On September 9th, 1999, Vicky, 14-year-old niece, and the teen's boyfriend held a gun to Alita's head while Vernon was at work. Vicky then gave her a lethal injection of methamphetamine and insulin to kill her. Alita's 3-year-old daughter witnessed the crime and was left alone with her mother's dead body. Vicky was later arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She is now spending the rest of her life behind bars. Number 6. Coeur d'Alene Killer. In May 2005, serial killer Joseph Edward Duncan murdered Brenda Graney, her teenage son Slade, Brenda's boyfriend Mark McKenzie, all after sneaking into their home in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. After killing the family, he kidnapped the mother's son and the boy's 8-year-old sister, Shasta. He took the children into the Montana wilderness where he physically tortured them for weeks before killing Dylan, who was only 9 years old. Luckily, Shasta was spotted in a restaurant with the man where he was reported and arrested. The girl was saved, but the emotional trauma she endured would last the rest of her life. After being taken into custody, Duncan also confessed to murdering 10-year-old Anthony Martinez while he played at a neighbor's yard back in 1997. Duncan originally tried to grab Anthony's younger brother, but when he tried to stop him, the killer took him instead. He forced Anthony into his car and drove away. The boy's body was found 2 weeks later. The killer was sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, but was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer and died on death row in March of 2021. Do you support the death penalty? Let us know what you think in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 5. Crime of Passion. In June 2006, a loaf of time, a 51-year-old man from Caldwell, Idaho, beheaded his wife, Teresa. After the murder, he took her head into his truck and drove directly into traffic in an attempt to kill himself, too. Time survived the wreck, but the accident caused the death of Samantha Nina Murphy and her 4-year-old daughter, Jalen Grimes. Time reportedly pleaded with officers to end his life after his wife's head was ejected from his vehicle thanks to the collision. He had a suicide note with him and had apparently set aside money for, quote, unspecified arrangements after his death. Teresa's head led police to the rest of her body, and Time was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. He had a history of violence and was already facing battery charges for allegedly choking his wife in March of that same year. A judge issued a no-contact order which did not allow Time to see his wife, but Teresa had filed paperwork, so the order was withdrawn. The man pled guilty, which allowed him to avoid the death penalty, but he'll still spend the rest of his life in prison. Number 4. Ted Bundy's Idaho killing spree. You probably heard of Ted Bundy, who's responsible for the deaths of over 30 people and possibly even more, but did you know he was actually linked to some murders that took place in Idaho? That's right, Bundy's on our list. In Bundy's last interview before he was executed in 1989, he confessed to 2 murders in Idaho. The first was a 12-year-old girl named Lynette Culver in 1975. Culver had been walking home from school in Pocatello for lunch when she was abducted by Bundy. Her family was devastated and never gave up hope of her coming home, but they searched for years and her body was never found. It wasn't until the confession from Bundy 14 years after Lynette's disappearance that the family got any type of closure. Bundy also confessed to killing a young hitchhiker near Boise, Idaho, someone who has still not been identified by authorities. This news really rattled the Gem State and some people who would never feel safe again. This just goes to show that a serial killer can really strike anywhere, even somewhere like Idaho, a state with one of the lowest crime rates in the country. Number 3. Vacation murder. Lori Issenberg, a 66-year-old Idaho resident, was found guilty for killing her husband. She poisoned him and dumped his body over the side of their boat in Lake Coeur d'Alene. Lori tried to end the man's life once before while on vacation in Florida. Apparently her computer showed searches for, quote, Florida water depths, currents, tides, drowning, boat accidents, and boat rentals. The actual murder took place in February 2018 when the couple planned to take a romantic boat ride on the lake. Her 68-year-old husband, Larry Eisenberg, was a retired forester and was reported missing. Luckily, the police were able to find his body 16 days later to perform an autopsy. They found lethal amounts of Benadryl in the man's system, which is known to cause symptoms like blurred vision, rapid heartbeat, seizures, and in higher doses like this, death. According to court records, Lori started to plan the murder after she had been embezzling large amounts of cash from the nonprofit organization she works at. She worried that her husband would divorce her and take, quote, some, if not all, of their jointly owned property worth about $1.5 million, according to documents. Authorities started to suspect foul play when she waited for 2 hours to report her husband's disappearance to the police. She claimed Larry had fallen overboard while trying to fix the boat's motor, but the court saw right through her lies and she was arrested on February 24th for murder while she was already serving time for the embezzlement charges. Number 2, Boise's Murder House. In Boise, Idaho, a grisly murder took place in a house on Linden Street, a murder so horrible that the house is now notoriously called the Murder House. A man named Preston Murr was shot in the shoulder on June 30th, 1987 after getting into a fight with 2 other men. He tried to escape by running into the nearest house for help, but instead of answering the door, the neighbor called the police. That next morning, another call was placed to authorities, and when they showed up to investigate, they found a trail of blood leading from the neighbor's door to the house where the fight started. When the police entered the home, they were met with a horrifying murder scene. The 2 men involved were identified as Darren Cox and Daniel Rogers. After Murr tried to escape, Cox and Rogers followed him and dragged him back to the house, where they continued to shoot him to death. But the story doesn't end there. After killing the man, they chopped his body into pieces so they could dispose of him in the nearby Brownlee Reservoir. After Murr's body was discovered, Cox and Rogers were charged with murder. Nobody knows for sure what caused the fight, but the house where the killing happened still stands today and is allegedly worth close to $1 million. Number 1, Time for Them to Die. One chilly December night in 1990, 2 people were beaten to death with a baseball bat at the Rose Pub in Idaho. 32-year-old Keith Eugene Wells was out on parole for robbery when he stopped in at the bar. 20-year-old Brandy Rains, one of the establishment's employees, was trying to close the place up with 23-year-old John Justad, the pub's beer distributor. Wells was one of the last customers there that night when he made up his mind that it, quote, was time for them to die, end quote. Justad was coming out of the bathroom where Wells was waiting for him with a bat. The man beat Justad to death. When he finished, he turned his sights on Rains when she came to see what all the commotion was about. Wells wanted to leave no witnesses to his crime. He escaped that night, and it wasn't until April 1991 that he was caught and apprehended for murder. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection in 1992, and after spending 2 years on death row, the families of the victims watched as Wells took his last breath. The execution was the first in Idaho after 17 years. What are some of the crazy crimes that have happened in your state? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Bad Badger.